Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had a contract of marriage with Aisha when she was 6, and he consummated the marriage when she was 9. People look at this and say, oh my gosh, this is atrocious. Well, we say you're using the fallacy of presentism, which is what? You claim the morals that we have today are the best morals. There are certain things that back then, if people looked at us today, will say we are living like animals. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not marry a child. We say she reached the age of adulthood. Now, just because we have this concept of teenagers, we say that you cannot look at it with these lens and judge people in the past, because back then it was norm. And if it was abnormal, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had a lot of enemies that hated him. Not a single one of them. He was called all sorts. They called him a magician. They called him a soothsayer. They called him this and that. But not a single person came and said, well, hold on a second. You came to be the prophet of God, and you're here marrying a 9-year-old. So back then, it was the absolute norm. Now, when it comes to the age of consent, does that mean that myself or my child or my daughter, that she needs to get married at 6 or 9? No, because we take the Prophet Muhammad as an example for all time. Let's suppose, well and good, back then it was okay. But are you going to do that now? No, because our religion doesn't teach us that. In Islam, you cannot cause harm. In the UK, the legal age is what? 16?
16.
Okay, but we have a lot of teenage pregnancies, like 12, 13,
100%.
left, right, center. Islam says, hold on a second. So if she's 16 tomorrow, but she's 15 today, so it's illegal today, but it's legal tomorrow. What changed in 24 hours? So Islam says not one shoe fits all. What Islam says is the following. Each girl has to be assessed individually. So you can't come and give one age, because there might be a girl that's 16-year-old in UK, but she's not ready for sex.
None of what he said addressed the fact that you believe in a prophet that RAPE'd a 9-year-old. That's a lot of distraction from the fact. Okay, here's the thing. This is not about present versus past. This is about harm reduction. So you're like, are you imposing your understanding of what's moral on people back then? Yeah, it's called having a standard, right? It's called having a standard. Based on our standard, this was an act of evil because it harms, because without informed consent, without any consent actually, because back then the parents decided, you had sexual relationships with a child, with a 9-year-old. We know. Okay, so you're like, oh, back then people didn't know better. Okay. That still doesn't negate the fact that what they did was horrible. Having sexual relationship with a 9-year-old is harmful to that child. If your moral standard is harm reduction, that is immoral. It's just as simple as that. But let's go through everything he said line by line and figure out what point he's trying to make. Here, if any of them address this issue. Okay, so here's our claim, right? Not now, not in the future, not back then, not ever is it okay for anybody to have sexual relationship with a 9-year-old. That is the claim. Why? Because it's harmful. Okay? And it's based on rule utilitarianism. So you come up with a rule that in general you understand that it causes a lot more harm than any benefit. And based on that principle, you decide that this is wrong. This is our standard. And this standard is time independent. Okay? Just because people that had different standards back then, okay, I'm not judging them by their standards. I'm judging it by our standards, by my standard. Is our standard more modern? Yes. But it is a standard. It's the whole point of asking, is something moral? When you're asked, is this moral? You are being asked to judge it based on the current standards that you have. Like, okay, well, their standards were different. I don't give a crap. You're asking me, how do I judge it based on my standards? If in a society, okay, sacrificing children in a volcano was considered good, and you ask me, is that a good thing that they did that? And I say, well, no, you're burning children alive. That's not a good thing. And like, well, it was good according to them back then. Who gives a crap? I am judging based on my standard. Like, well, their standard was different. Well, their standard sucks. Their standard is outdated. Their standard is horrible. Is throwing acid in people's faces a good thing or a bad thing? Well, I consider it a bad thing. Well, what about the people who consider it a good thing? They could go get fucked. Like, what the hell? What has that got to do with this answering this question?
But the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had a contract of marriage with Aisha when she was 6, and he consummated the marriage when she was 9. People look at this and say,
that's it. That it should be the end of Islam. That you need to know nothing else about Islam. That should be the end of it. They have a prophet. They have a prophet that they celebrate, that they love, that they consider as a role model for all men at all time, and he did this. He had sex with a 9-year-old, and they don't deny it. How is that not the end of Islam? Like, why do oh, you don't understand Islam? You have to know Arabic. You have to know good 5 doctorate degrees in ancient Arabic, like, I don't know, culture and literature and Islamic history and fiqh. You have to be an expert in fiqh. You have to go speak to the ulama, to the scholars. You can't. They tell you that you cannot deny Islam until you understand all these complicated things. Okay, imagine all of those complicated, all of this Islamic fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, all of that, one theology, Islamic history on one side. Okay, let's say I am completely ignorant of all of that detail. I have no knowledge. I haven't studied Islam at all. I haven't spent half a second in going into any of those details. And I have only this piece of information. People are like, how could you criticize Islam when you haven't studied Islam? By the way, I have studied Islam. But if you in the audience, if you're somebody that has not studied Islam, okay, ask yourself, do I need to know anything more than the fact that the prophet of this religion had sexual intercourse with a 9-year-old? And this person is considered to be perfect by this religion.
oh my gosh, this is atrocious. Well, we say you're using the fallacy of presentism, which is what? You claim the morals that we have today are the best morals. There are certain things.
Now, it's possible for us to have in our modern times moral standards that are worse sometimes than previous. That's not the claim. This is your logical fallacy, okay? Is strawman. That's not the argument. So you are changing our moral standard. My moral standard, the one that I think works the best, is rule utilitarianism. So we don't say that whatever is more recent is the best. That's not the argument. Generally, things seem to be progressing on average more into better moral standards compared to before, but not always. Like Nazism was an ideology that was created in modern times, and it sucks. Their moral standard, which is social Darwinism as a moral standard, sucks, and it's more recent compared to some other ancient ideologies.
They will say we are living like animals. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not marry a child. We say she reached the age of adulthood. Now, just because...
Yeah, that's okay. Here's the thing. We say she reached the age of adulthood. That's the problem. You're like, oh, back then. That's where the standards back then. But how come you are Ali Dawah? Do you own a time machine? Are you coming to us and speaking to us from the past? Because you just said that, like, you're saying that we're committing the logical fallacy of presentism, and this was back then. However, you now are saying we say that she reached the age of adulthood. So you managed to bring it into the present, unless you're talking from 1400 years ago from now. That's very impressive if you're doing that. So that's the problem with your religion. I mean, we would be less concerned. We will still condemn your prophet if he had sex with a 9-year-old. But we would be less concerned with it if it was the standards back then stayed for back then. The problem with religion is that it makes the standards of back then stay with us for longer. That's the whole point of being anti-religion. People are like, oh, how are you judging people back then? Well, because you're bringing it to now. You just said so.
We have this concept of teenagers. We say that you cannot look at it with these lens and judge people in the past, because back.
Okay, yeah, then they keep it in the past. Hey, you cannot judge. Okay, I would be happy to do that. Like, you can. First of all, I can judge people in the past. Okay, we judge them all the time. We don't expect them to have behave differently, but we still judge them. Okay, but let's say we didn't judge them. Okay, fine. Here's the thing. I will make a deal with you, Ali Dawah. I will stop judging people back then. Okay, as long as you keep their standards for back then. But what do I do when you say that your prophet is the role model for all time? The Quran says that, and that we have to follow his model. So now it's our problem now.
Back then it was norm, and if it was abnormal.
By the way, back then this was not norm. Okay, back then, let me tell you guys, a lot of people lie. But see, back then it was norm to have sex with a 9-year-old. Back then it was norm to have sex with a 14-year-old, a 13-year-old, pushing it 12-year-olds. Okay, that's really pushing it. Okay, maybe like 12. That was the norm. Even back then, it was not norm to have sex with a 9-year-old. Even back then. You know how I know this? Because Abu Bakr said so. He's going to make this point. Because even back then, people understood that when you are having sex with girls by age 12, something really dangerous happens. I don't know if I should even mention this to you guys, but the wall between, the poop hole and the sex hole, there's a wall between them. Okay, I'm just trying to use these words that YouTube doesn't hate us for it. There's a wall between your poop hole and your sex hole for women. And that wall is very, very, very thin and delicate, especially when you're a child. And when you have sex with a child, that wall could break apart. And then the poop goes into the sex hole. The poop, and is a disaster. And it's almost impossible to fix, especially back then. So, and people knew that because people tried doing these things and it destroyed these girls. And right now we see this in Africa, the people have sex with 12-year-old girls, and this happens a lot. So imagine doing that to a 9-year-old. People knew that this is not the time to do this. Even back then, they knew that this is not the time to do this. So yeah, people used to marry a lot younger. But by younger, we're talking 13, 14, not 9. And
if it was abnormal, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had a lot of enemies that hated him. Not a single one of them. He was called all sorts. They called him a magician. They called him a soothsayer. They called him this and that. But not a single person came and said, well, hold on a second. You came to be the prophet of God, and you're here marrying a 9-year-old. So
the father of that girl said that. Abu Bakr at some point said, isn't Aisha too young to marry? He said that. Abu Bakr said that. By the way, the time he's lying about this, because Ali Dawah knows, I think he knows this, okay? Ali Dawah knows that Muhammad was being spoken like this when he was not in power yet. So all of the things that he just said, that people said about the prophet, that he's mad, that he's a magician, that he's Majnoon, okay? That demons have possessed him, jinns have possessed him, all right? They said these things about him when he was still early on in his prophethood career, when he didn't control, when he didn't have an army, when he hadn't invaded Makkah yet. When he had Aisha, okay, at that point, when he was ruling over Yathrib, over Medina. And he was not very friendly to people who made fun of him.